This weekend gives the Kremlin the final opportunity to influence Moldova away from its current European Union trajectory. So how close will the election be, and what does this mean for the country Moldova? So Privyt, welcome to Geopolitics from Ukraine with Connor Klein. Got my Moldova polo shirt on today. I'm here in Odessa. Got the port just behind me. And just up the road, about 2 hours maybe to get to the border and cross it, is the country of Moldova. It is very close here to Odessa, as you see, and pivotal in the Kremlin strategy to persuade parts of its former empire to return to its sphere of influence. Now, late last year there was a presidential election in Moldova. The incumbent, Maya Sandu, who is pro-Moldova joining the European Union, she won that. She won with a 55-45% split. Just before that, there was a referendum which enshrined into the Moldovan constitution that they are on a course to join the European Union. That passed, but only just. It was like around 50.5 versus 49.5%. So you can see things are quite tight politically in Moldova in terms of the pro-EU path and the pro-Russia path. Her opponent in the second round of the presidential election was from a region called Gagauzia, where there is overwhelming support for remaining in Russia's sphere of influence. Also, Moldova has a frozen conflict. There is a de facto independent part of the country known as Transnistria, and there, although it is quite small, people tend to vote overwhelmingly in favor of pro-Russian candidates. Now, if we look at the opinion polls, well, we know in general it's pretty hard to get good polling nowadays. We've seen it across the world in other elections. It seems that the polls are quite tight. On average, they put the ruling party, which is Maya Sandu's party, which is a pro-EU party, PAS or PAS, in the lead, but not with enough votes to get a majority. So this would mean that they would have to, if that were the case, where they were to be the biggest party and not have a majority in the parliament. Parliament is 101 seats, so you need 51 for a parliamentary majority. Then they would have to go into coalition. However, that is going to be extremely difficult if we look at the polling, because there are really not any other significant pro-EU parties that are credible as pro-EU parties. There is a new party called the Alternative Bloc, and they say that they're pro-European. However, they also include the opponent of Maya Sandu in the presidential election only less than a year ago, where he was advocating for a pro-Russian path. So there is a lot of speculation that this new party is just pseudo pro-Europeans, actually a Russian Trojan horse, and trying to take some of the votes from Maya Sandu's party. And then we have the main pro-Russia party, which is known as the Victory Bloc. And they are definitely pro-Russian. So in the event that there is a result that gives either a majority to the pro-Russian parties, well, we'll talk about that in a second, it's going to have major ramifications for Moldova. But even if there is a victory of sorts for the ruling party, which is pro-EU, and they're the biggest in the parliament, but not a majority, it will make it quite complicated for them. The big kicker is, like in the presidential election, like in the referendum, the polling does not include the Moldovan diaspora. Now, Moldova as a country is quite small, it has a population of about 2.5 million, and there are up to about 1 million Moldovans living abroad, maybe even more than that, and they vote as a consistency, pretty much as a bloc in these elections. They count for around 15, maybe a little bit over 15% of the electorate that votes, looking at the results in the referendum and in the presidential election late last year. And they vote overwhelmingly in favor of pro-EU candidates. So you could expect a 10 percentage point swing just based on the diaspora alone. And in the polling, they don't take that into account. They actually poll people in Moldova. They don't poll the diaspora. So you would have to factor in, based on what we saw last year, a plus 10 percentage point addition for the ruling party, which would bring them up very close to potentially getting a majority in parliament, although we have to see what happens. Also, if you're watching this on election night, the votes from the diaspora tend to be counted last. Most of the diaspora that votes is based in the European Union or in the UK or in some other Western country, hence why they vote so heavily in favor of pro-EU candidates, and their votes will be counted last, so expect a lot of tension where it could be neck and neck or only a slight majority for the ruling party, and then all of a sudden, boom, when the last votes are counted, they get most of them, because about 90% based on what happened last year will vote for the pro-EU candidates. So, assuming, let's take scenario one, that Moldova votes in the ruling party, PAS, and they can continue on their pro-EU path, because then they'll have the presidency and the parliament for another term. That would basically be another 5 years. Moldova has a target date to join the European Union in 2030. Now, traditionally, countries, they miss these target dates. The EU accession process, because there's so many criteria to ensure that they meet the standards, that they actually really reform, that they're eligible to join. It's not like joining the Russian sphere of influence, where basically, as long as you say you join, you're in, you're welcome, because they don't, worry about things like corruption, obviously, or other things that you would have to change in terms of your economy to make it less of an oligarchy, etc., and respect the free market. Those are characteristics of what a candidate country for joining the European Union would have to do. I'll give lots of other different criteria. There's like what's known as acquis communautaire. I used to work as a lawyer at the European Commission many years ago, so I'm pretty familiar with how the whole thing works. So if we look back at when Croatia joined, it took them over 10 years. So if Moldova were to join by 2030, considering it only became a candidate country back in 2022, wasn't it? It was after the invasion here by Moscow of Ukraine, the 2022 invasion. So I think it was back in 2022. They at least applied then became a candidate country. So we'll say it will only been 7 or 8 years. That would be pretty impressive if they were able to join in that time span. It is possible. They would have to have fulfilled all the criteria by around 2028 in order for the other parts of the procedure, like it been actually verified in each member state that they want to accept Moldova as a new member of the European Union, and that process takes well over a year normally before it goes through all the different parliaments, and the European Parliament has to vote on it. So there's a big long legal procedure. Could they get there by 2028? Well, if the ruling party that's pro-EU wins the election on this Sunday, then they would actually have a mandate that would extend beyond that, and presumably if they manage to reform Moldova successfully with both the presidency and the parliament, that would be a real possibility, and that would completely scupper the Kremlin's plans to take over Moldova, pull it back into its sphere of influence. They were scuppered by the fact that, in particular, this city was defended, Odessa in Ukraine, by the Ukrainian military. If you think back to 2022, when they came out of Crimea, which they were already occupying illegally, the Russian forces came up. They went to Mykolaiv, which is pretty close to here, having taken Kherson, and then went up to a city called, it's a small town called Voznesensk, and they were, if they gotten through that city, they could have actually just gone further north, taken another nuclear power plant, and then swung into Moldova. There is actually a road that runs there from just north of Voznesensk all the way across to Transnistria, where there is a pro-Russian de facto separatist government. So they were pretty close, and a bit too close for comfort then. That was probably their best opportunity, because now they do not have a land border with the occupied territory. They obviously were also ejected from both Mykolaiv and the city of Kherson, sent back across the other side of the river Dnipro, and they are quite a long way from actually being able to influence Moldova directly with their military, and they don't have a border. So their last chance is to destabilize Moldova politically and try to get pro-Russian candidates into power so that they will wrestle Moldova and its future away from the European Union. If you want to know why countries like Moldova want to join the EU and not stay in Russia's sphere of influence, it is simply just look at a country like Poland and go there and see how modern it is, the infrastructure, and then look at countries that hung out with Russia. I mean, you could say Belarus, and it is basically, it's basically decades behind, and they share a border. So that is the main driver is the fact that Moldovans want their country to have the economic benefits and the modernization that being Russia's sphere of influence does not typically result in. So the Russian strategy, it includes a fugitive known as Ilan Shor. He basically is accused of probably the biggest bank heist in history. Basically over $1 billion went missing from the Moldovan banks over a decade ago. And he is accused of basically being a Russian agent of sorts who then tries to influence Moldovan politics with money. There are other strategies that have been going on in terms of promoting through social media, TikTok, a bit like what we saw in Romania prior to their presidential elections back late last year as well. So it's a full court press in terms of the media sphere. There's so much disinformation. I even come across it myself. One of the funny ones is that NATO, or i.e. Romanian troops, are now lining up on the border of Moldova to invade, which is a bit of a projection by Russian disinformation. I saw it on Russian TV, and it's because so many Moldovans still speak Russian. If they have access to these channels, they will be listening that NATO wants to invade them, which couldn't be further from the truth, because what is the Romanian military or the US military under Donald Trump? They are not lining up on the border with tanks to invade poor little Moldova, that is for sure. But in order to persuade Moldovans that they are in danger, that they should still side with Moscow for their own protection, you see just a lot of money and a lot of disinformation being spread in order to influence the electorate. At the same time, because Moldova was in the Soviet Union, because a lot of people do speak Russian, there is a bit of a societal split that I see from being there in terms of people who support joining the EU versus people who support staying in Russia's sphere of influence. Many of these factors are level of higher education. More educated you are, more likely you are to be pro-EU. If your native language is Romanian as opposed to Russian, then you're more likely to support joining the EU. If you have traveled and lived and worked in the European Union, because so many Moldovans have Romanian passports, which is a member of the European Union, so they can actually move and work, is actually very common in Ireland, for example. I think Moldovans are the 5th biggest nationality that are foreigners in Ireland, so a lot of them go to work there. Again, this is why the diaspora in the European Union votes so heavily in favor of pro-EU candidates. And that also age is a factor. The older people who tend to so if you're older or lower educated and speak Russian, then more likely to support staying in Russia's sphere of influence versus someone who's maybe young, Romanian speaking, travels a lot and is higher educated, much more likely to support joining the European Union. So it's going to be probably a pretty tense election. It's very hard to call it right now because it's unclear, looking at the polling, even including the 10% for the diaspora, that the ruling party PS will have enough to secure a new majority. And if it turns out that the pro-Russian parties, whether they're officially pro-Russian or just in reality pro-Russian with a pro-European Union veneer, if they actually get a majority, they will be able to stymie the reforms in Moldova so that they will be eligible to meet the criteria for joining the European Union. That would definitely slow it down. It would not mean that they would be able to swing Moldova back into Russia's orbit. They would basically put the brakes on it actually being able to leave, at least until there are new elections, because presumably they would just block everything through the parliament in terms of the reforms that are necessary. So definitely I see it as the last political chance for pro-Russian forces in Moldova to prevent what it will be, if they fail, an inexorable trajectory to join the European Union by Moldova. So by Sunday evening or Monday morning, we should have a clear indication, and I will be back to give you my analysis on the results. Okay, so drop your comments and questions down below in the comment section to this video. Let me know if you've been to Moldova, what you think will happen, whether you've seen some of the disinformation, misinformation, shenanigans that have been going on with respect to this election in Moldova, and your other thoughts about what it means maybe for here in Odessa if eventually Russia is able to flip Moldova back into Russia's sphere of influence, would that create, for example, a big security problem for Ukraine if they have these pro-Russian troops in Transnistria, or officially Russian troops? There's a small number, about 1,500 officially. Who knows how many are really there? And what would be the reaction by Ukraine if that were the case? I guess on Monday, if it turns out that the pro-Russian forces have managed to win the elections, then we would have to discuss that in greater detail. Until then, I am going to enjoy what is now autumn in Odessa, Mama, because yesterday was really the last day of summer and now the temperatures have dropped. So until the next video, la rivedere and chat soon.